Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through the current version of my Sunday sermon. The Orthodox Church grows in the West, and this is something that I never knew about until I get on YouTube and I make friends with Orthodox people. And after the Chino conference, we had a little tour of an Orthodox church. Many of the people who have gone to church because of listening to me, or at least I've had a hand in that, go to Orthodox churches. Do I have a problem with that? No. Do I completely understand it? I understand something of it, but I wouldn't say I completely understand it. This dynamic is, I think, interesting and important for a lot of different reasons. One of the interesting pieces of it is that historically, Orthodox churches have been state churches, as has Roman Catholic Church. States have embraced the Roman Catholic Church. Orthodox churches, Putin, for example, Moscow is sometimes called the third Rome. Rome, Constantinople, Moscow. The Bill of Rights, of course, took all of this off the table in the United States, but there's a lot of questions about Christianity and its relationship with state power. They go back a long ways. I was reading, in my trip to Italy, I was reading some things about the papacy and Italian history. And so one of the things that it sort of drew my attention to were the history of the popes. And it's a very, very interesting history. And so I've read a bunch of books, and I wanted to be fair. So I read a few books by this Roman Catholic scholar, John O'Malley. In his book on the history of the popes, chapter 3, he calls Constantine the third apostle. And that's quite something. Constantine was not a pope, but the Roman emperor from 312 to 337. Yet he was, with the exception of St. Peter himself, says John O'Malley, more important for the papacy and for Christianity itself than any pope. Some people hailed the decree of Vatican Council II, 62 to 65, on church-state relations as the end of the Constantinian era, by which they meant the end of 1700 years of certain pattern of church-state relationships that had their origin with the emperor. The assertion may be exaggerated, but it at least indicates that something monumentous happened to the church with Constantine, and that is true. And I can't in this sermon talk about this. It's an enormous conversation that is worth having, but it's something that at least I can point to. Again, while I was on my Italy trip, I started reading this story of the Pope and Mussolini. Before Vatican II, actually, the Second World War sort of provoked Vatican II in some ways. Prior to Italian unification, the Pope was the civic ruler of certain portions of Italy. And as Italian unification progressed, the Pope lost his land and eventually became a prisoner of the Vatican. And that was the situation by the time of the Second World War. And when Mussolini came to power, Pope Pius XI thought maybe this would be an opportunity for the papacy to regain some of the power and legitimacy that it had had. But of course, after the Second World War, that faced a horrible collapse. And it was only in the wake of the Second World War that the papacy had to formally embrace democracy as a valid form of government. And that's, in fact, what O'Malley is talking about in Vatican II. Just this week, in fact, was posted on YouTube a speech given by, I'd call him a friend for my part. I don't know him that well. We've done an event together. Paul Kingsnorth, who became Orthodox a number of years ago. He was sort of a radical environmentalist, spent some time in Wiccan, a whole bunch of things, and then became a Christian and an Orthodox Christian. But then he gave a speech at First Things, which is a journal that over the last number of years has sort of been a voice of Roman Catholic post-liberal integralism, or let's say post-liberalism. And while in many ways Paul Kingsnorth is post-liberal, the title of his speech was Against Christian Civilization, which struck a real interesting juxtaposition, which goes to show again that this conversation about the relationship between, as would be framed much later, secular power and church power is a very complex one. There's a long, long conversation about Jesus, Rome, Jerusalem, and to the ends of the world. Now, the last couple of sermons have focused on this issue, but in an Old Testament frame. We've talked about David, and we've talked about Solomon. Now, after Solomon, everything fell apart. We talked about Solomon last week. Israel inherited the earth and nearly immediately began to lose it. Jeroboam took almost everything and left little Judah. John Bright, in his History of Israel, summarizes the relative power between the northern state of Israel and the southern state of Judah this way. Two states, though superficially similar, were in important respects quite different. Judah, though smaller and poorer, had a more homogeneous population and relative geographical isolation. Israel was larger and wealthier and nearly the center of the old tribal system, contained a large Canaanite population, and was, by accident of geography, more exposed to outside influence. Moreover, one had and the other lacked a stable dynastic tradition. Different theories of the state prevailed. Because of these things, the internal histories of the two states exhibit marked differences. All the way already in northern Israel, successions of power began to happen like they did and have done throughout much of the world, where usually a powerful general or a powerful man supplants the previous king, and around it goes. But the Book of Kings always sees this as the hand of God, moving from one thing to another. After Jeroboam's dynasty was torn down, the northern kingdom itself almost had a civil war, or did have a civil war, and eventually Omri prevailed. In the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, they told time by virtue of monarchs' reigns, Omri became king of Israel, and he reigned 12 years, 6 of them in Tisra. He bought the hill of Samaria from Shermer for 2 talents of silver, and built a city on the hill, calling it Samaria, after Shermer, the name of the former owner of the hill. And in some ways, the northern kingdom was sort of trying to establish a legitimacy that David and Solomon and the southern kingdom have had. Jeroboam put up golden calf statues in the north and the south so people wouldn't go down to Jerusalem, to Solomon's temple, to continue to worship God, even though ostensibly many of them still believed in the Lord. The rulers of the northern kingdom saw this as a threat to their legitimacy and their control of the people. Omri, he followed completely the ways of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, in other words, the golden calves, committing the same sin Jeroboam had caused Israel to commit, worshiping the golden calves, so that they roused the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, by their worthless idols. As for the other events of Omri's reign, what he did and the things he achieved, are they not written in the annals of the kings of Israel? One thing that the Book of Kings borrows from, but does not reproduce. Omri rested with his ancestors and was buried in Samaria, and Ahab, his son, succeeded him. Now, Omri in many ways would sort of set the pattern, but Ahab is the one that the Bible remembers. Israel's recovery of stability happened under Omri. He was a tyrant enough to sort of suppress everything and establish a degree of prosperity and stability. Though his reign was brief, 876 to 869, he was able to establish a dynasty that held power to the 3rd generation, and to initiate a policy that restored to Israel a measure of strength and prosperity. So it's very interesting. So on one hand, the Book of Kings gives a certain valence to the reign of Omri, but historians looking back over the record, looking back at relative prosperity, it's very interesting that the Book of Kings says God was not happy with them, but during the reign of Omri, a lot of people would say, well, things seem to be going fine. Although the Bible dismisses his reign in 5 or 6 verses, Omri was obviously a man of great ability. The Assyrians referred to Israel as the house of Omri, long after his dynasty had been overthrown. Omri's policy for Israel's recovery was patterned in its major features of David and Solomon. It called for internal peace, friendly relations with Judah, close ties with the Phoenicians, and a strong hand east of Jordan, particularly against the Arameans. This policy was launched by Omri and set forward by his son Ahab in a series of steps which, owing to the nature of our sources, cannot be ranged in chronological order. In other words, for all his rebellion against God, Omri and Ahab's turn to the religion of their neighbors and to the religion sort of adopting what would be normal in the world seemed to work well for their country, and people thought, well, things are going just fine. Omri brought stability, had a reign of at least, had a dynasty that went to 3 generations. Everything looks good. In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel, and he reigned in Samaria over Israel 22 years. Long reign. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, that was the golden calves in the south and in the north, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. Now we should remember that Solomon married a princess of Egypt and princesses of other nations as well, and began to serve Baal and worship him. So in other words, Ahab has basically decided, well, we can keep this golden calf cult going on, but what we really need is strong alliance with Tyre and Sidon, and the way to do that is to worship the same God. And Jezebel apparently was a great promoter of the religion of the land that she came from. He set up an altar for Baal and the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also had made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than all of the kings of Israel before him. Now, last week I talked a bit about that there's always sort of this dead reckoning with respect to, is God happy or sad, based on how's the economy going? Are there natural disasters? Are there plagues? Things like this. With Omri, things seem to be flourishing. And with Ahab, things seem to be flourishing. But the book of Kings says, actually, God is getting angry. What's this going to mean? In Ahab's time, Hiel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho. He laid its foundation at the cost of his firstborn son, Abiram, and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest, Shegub, in accordance with the word the Lord spoken through Joshua, son of Nun. If you remember the story of Jericho, Jericho was to be left unreconstructed, even though, if you can see on this map here, it sits at a strategic site. And especially now that the kingdom is divided, it sits right on the border of Judah and right by the Jordan River at the edge of that valley. And so that's an important trade route. It's an important strategic post. And in fact, he rebuilt it as per what Joshua, son of Nun, said at the death of his firstborn and his youngest son. And, well, the others in between, perhaps. Now, Elijah the Tishbite, from Tishbe in Gilead, and I've got that here on the map, said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word." Things seem to be going quite swimmingly. The book of Kings says the Lord is getting angry. Doesn't seem to be reflected in the fortune of the nation. But up pops this man, Elijah. Now, one commentator notes that there's no real introduction for Elijah. 17:1 is striking. We are impressed with the suddenness of Elijah's appearance. Everything seemed to be capitulating to Baal, when suddenly we are staring at a prophet whose confession of faith is his name. My name is Yahweh, or Elijah, or my name is Yah. He was not used to this. We are not used to this. Even in the Bible, we expect a bit of warm-up, a far more deliberate approach. In the King James and the Revised Standard style, we would expect to read, "Now behold, there was a man who lived in Gilead, a prophet, Elijah the Tishbite by name, son of so-and-so and son of so. And it came to be that when Ahab began worshiping Baal, that the word of the Lord came to him, saying, Arise, go to Samaria and say to Ahab." We have none of that. Elijah just shows up. By the life of the Lord, the God of Israel, before whom I stand, there will be no dew nor rain in these years, except by my word. Now these were the covenant curses that were in fact listed in the book of Deuteronomy. And it's also important because Baal is a storm god. And that region of the world, similar to California, is very dependent on seasonal rains. If someone would show up at Gavin Newsom and say, there'll be no rain in California except by my word, well, people would find this strange. But Elijah shows up and basically says to Baal, he can pound sand. No rain, no dew, no nothing. You're all cut off. Let's see how prosperous you are now. When the word of the Lord came to Elijah, leave here, turn eastward and ride to Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food here. So he did what the Lord had told him, and he went to Kerith ravine, east of Jordan, and stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. So Israel is dying of thirst. And the crops are withering, and the plants are suffering, and they're always looking over at the Mediterranean, like California looks out over the Pacific this time of year and wonders, will the rains come? Will the rains come? Will the rains come? And they did not come to Israel. But the Lord squirrels Elijah away and says, don't worry, Elijah, I'm taking care of you. My work with you is not yet done. So sets him by a brook and feeds him and gives him drink from the brook. Sometime later, the brook dried up because there was no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. That's strange. Zarephath, you can look on the map. I thought the real problem was Tyrian Baal and Jezebel, son of Ethbaal, Tyre and Sidon. They are of the Phoenicians. That's Baal country up there. Why would you go there? Now, it's interesting because, of course, Ahab married a Phoenician princess for whom Ahab built the temple of Baal. And Jezebel loved her God and wanted everybody to love him too, and thought that Baal was the most obvious way to peace and prosperity so that the nation would thrive. Why send Elijah into the camp of the enemy? Now, the Bible has type scenes, and there's always sort of a pattern to these things. And just listen to this verse and see if it reminds you of anything. So he went to Zarephath, where he came to a town gate, and a woman was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so that I might have a drink? The drink-fetching motif. Now, this isn't exactly a perfect type, but there are resonances here. Remember the story of Sodom in Genesis, which was all about hospitality and how a stranger in the town square would be treated? Remember the story of Gibeah, which echoed Sodom that we read a number of weeks ago, about hospitality. Remember Abraham's servant looking for a wife for Isaac, finding Rebekah at the well. Remember Jacob finding Rachel at the well. Remember Jesus asking the Samaritan woman for water at a well. Now there's a bunch of things that are a little different, but Elijah goes to this pagan town and asks a widow for water. As she was going to get it, Wow. She shows hospitality. And called, and bring me, please, a piece of bread. Now, there are type scenes in many things, and some of you might think, typical man. And while you're at it, bring me a sandwich. Our culture has type scenes too. But this is a test of hospitality, and she's open to him, but the bread request is going to be a little complicated, and it provokes something, not unlike, again, how Jesus with the Samaritan woman, that provoked something. As surely as the Lord your God lives, in other words, she's Phoenician. She's a Baal worshiper. She lives in the land of Baal. She knows the Israelites. She knows that they have their own God. People get around. They understand this. And she's very hospitable, so she frames it in terms he will understand. As surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little of olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. Now, what happens in a drought? Well, many of us here in California know a lot about drought, but not a whole lot about drought because we have all these reservoirs and a globalized food supply and wealth and all that. But generally speaking, what happens in a wealth is that in a drought is that food prices go up, and the poorest, like a widow with a son, will suffer the most. And she is out of money to buy oil. She's got a little bit of flour left, and she's expecting that with these sticks, she can light that fire, she can bake some bread, and this will be it for her and her son. And yet, she goes and fetches water for this man and basically says, if I have bread, I would give it to you. Now, part of the point of these other scenes of Sodom and Gibeah and, well, finding wives up in the North Country again, and a Samaritan woman is, how hospitable will they be? The righteousness of this woman seems to excel more certainly than the belief of Jezebel and, in fact, the king of Israel, Ahab. What will Elijah do? Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said, but first make a small loaf for me and from what you have and bring it to me, and then make some for you and your son. Whoa. Stranger at a gate, strange man, foreigner. You really expect her to do this? For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. Is this a scam? Everybody's suffering right now. Food prices have gone sky high. Elijah's hungry, and he says, okay, I know you're about to die. Feed me first, even before yourself and your son. What foreign widow would do this? Ahab, in fact, they had God. He was God's chosen people in charge. And in fact, if you read a little bit further to 1 Kings 22, Ahab has a prophet problem. He keeps being annoyed by prophets because they keep criticizing him, and they don't know doesn't quite know what to do with it. The Deuteronomic deal was keep the covenant and God will take care of you. Jeroboam made calves to represent Israel's God, like Aaron did. We all know how well that went. Ahab decides to go all in with the gods of Tyre and his rivals. And now Elijah is in the house of Tyre saying, my God is alive. Would you believe in him more than you believe in your own gods? This story pokes a finger at Ahab. Puts a test before Ahab, a test that Ahab has failed. She went away and did as Elijah had told her. She has more belief in Israel's God than Ahab. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of oil was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word the Lord spoke by Elijah. more than the king of Israel. The story goes deeper, still goes. When her son dies, and Elijah goes before the Lord and says, Lord, please. And the son is brought back to life. What is going on here? This pagan woman has more faith than Israel's king. Now, in the New Testament, in Luke chapter 4, there's a story of Jesus going home to Nazareth. That's up in that northern area that had been the nation of Israel. And goes and speaks in the local synagogue and gives a great sermon. And everyone seems pleased. Maybe this Jesus will make a difference. Maybe he'll be able to drive out the Romans and redeem Israel and make her great again, the way David and Solomon had. But then Jesus sort of blows it. Jesus said to them, surely you will quote this proverb to me, physician, heal yourself. And you will tell me, do here in your hometown what we have heard you do in Capernaum. Do a miracle. Give us a show. You're famous for a reason, Jesus. Don't leave us out. Truly, I tell you, he continued, no prophet is acceptable in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. Yeah, what about that? Weren't there widows when the prices went up? Weren't there starving widows and dying sons in Israel? Why wasn't God taking care of his chosen people? And there were many in Israel with leprosy at the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed. Only Naaman the Syrian, another enemy, another foreigner. All of the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this because Jesus, you're supposed to be dealing with the foreigners. Jesus, don't you know that, well, have you been constructing that big pagan subdivision that they show us all their wealth and they parade it with their fine homes and people from all over the empire move into our country? Aren't you supposed to do something about that? And here you pick these two issues with these two of our most favored prophets and you stick this in our face? They got up, drove him out of town, and took him to the brink of a hill. Hometown makes good. Well, let's see if he can fly. In order to throw him from the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. Well, that didn't go so well. God's chosen people first, please. And yet God doesn't. This God. What's the point of having a national God if he doesn't show up for your side? Weren't there plenty of starving widows who couldn't afford food in the region because of Ahab's drought? If God's going to relieve some of the suffering he's dealing out, at least give it to his own people, not help this woman from the enemy who believes in the wrong God and everything. See, everybody believed that Jesus' job was David's job. Remember what Brueggemann said about David's job? It is the passionate desire of Israel that the Lord's powerful rule should take real effect, concrete form, so real and so powerful that the nations will notice and take into account. These chapters are the story of consolidation whereby God's rule becomes the hard-nosed, visible rule of David. Gifts have been given to Israel through David. Now these gifts must be organized, consolidated, and legitimated. And shouldn't that be what Jesus does? Paul Kingsnorth talked about that and said, this Jesus is a funny man. He says crazy things like, blessed are the meek. But what about our meek, Jesus? Certainly they should have priority. Nazareth thinks Jesus is losing the plot. Nazareth thinks hometown makes good when he begins to deliver for the people who should have his first allegiance. Nazareth isn't alone in this. Christians long feel the pinch. We identify with you. We give to your churches. We pray to you, and our children die like everyone else's. Aren't we supposed to see realized deliverance and anticipated deliverance? Jesus, why don't you show up for us? Why do you tell such strange stories? Why do you send Elijah to cozy up with this foreign woman, to give her bread to eat while your own people are starving, and to raise her son while our children die? Oh, what is this God about? Andrew Clavin, Jew by birth, converted to Christianity. He and his brothers talking about the stories of his people. The reason the Jews are God's chosen people is because no one would volunteer. Chosen for what? Clavin said so succinctly, they are the theater in which God plays out his relationship with humanity. There's so many narratives at play here. Ahab, why do you violate Deuteronomy? Lord, why don't you brought the drought. Why don't you relieve suffering to the humble and the meek of Israel? Not some widow in Zarephath. Maybe faith is stranger. Maybe in fact, the faith of someone who seems least deserving, or at least even the opportunity of faith, can outstrip that of the King of Israel. But of course, all of those strange narratives get combined when God would not only allow the sons of Israel to die, but the Son of Israel to die in the most humiliating way at the hands of their enemies. And he did it not just for his people, as everyone would have thought it to be in that culture war, but for us who are outside. Elijah was pointing to something, even if he couldn't have known what. But what do we do with kings? What should the church do? We're just, by the time when this sermon is preached, 2 days before the most important decision that you've ever had to make in your life, or at least over the last 4 years, when I can think the impact of the decisions that I make, I don't know that this is the most important decision that I've made all month. Thank you. Really. It's watered down amongst 330 million people. And, well, there it is. And come November 6th, half of the country will be happy, relieved, and optimistic, and the other half will be upset, angry, and sad. And as Lincoln noted in his second inaugural, many on both sides will be praying to the same God. God watches and still holds leaders and kings accountable. And God brings faith in very surprising people. The people of God endure under any administration. They do. They endured under Ahab and Jezebel. They'll endure under the winter, or the winter 4 years from now, as they have endured for the winter of the last 4 years and the 4 years before that. We will endure. In the United States, we are by no means the most difficult place to be a Christian in certain regards, or then maybe we are. God cannot be our hostage and will not be hostage of a king or a president or a dictator or anyone else. Our God is a free God. He does what he wants. And no matter what happens on this day, I'm sure he will keep us moving towards that day, the day when the King of Kings will be seen and every knee will bow. Amen.